Hi, my name is Michelle Lenz, and my presentation today will cover how Apis mellifera adapt to survive in cold climates through thermoregulation. Apis mellifera, commonly known as the western honeybee, is a species of bee named for its honey-making capabilities. Honeybees are highly eusocial species, and this means colony activity determines much of a honeybee's survival. Honeybees are considered superorganisms because of this, and this means that they work for the survival of the colony rather than each individual bee. The western honeybee can be found on every continent except Antarctica, and they have adapted to many geological environments, including winter climates, which is what we will be discussing in more detail today. So bees in winter. Unlike other bee species, Apis mellifera remain active throughout the winter. In other colonies, they hibernate for the winter, and usually only the queen survives and emerges in the spring to start a new brood. But honeybees are perennial colonies, meaning they survive year after year, and this is because of their high level of eusociality and permanence. There are three key factors that contribute to a honeybee's ability to survive the winter. The ones that we are going to discuss today are their honey food source, brood rearing behavior, and thermoregulation. So, stored honey provides both a heat source and a food source for bees once the foraging stops. And this is a big reason why bees work so hard all year round, and you hear the term busy bee is because they're trying to store up enough honey to last them through the winter. So once foraging sources disappear for the winter, honeybees settle in the hive, and that is where they remain for the rest of the winter. Drones are forced outside of the hive to conserve honey sources, which, while harsh, makes sense because, as mentioned earlier, the focus here is the survival of the hive and not individual bees. And if the hive runs out of honey before spring, it'll freeze and starve. So the diagram on the left shows how the honey is kept at the center of the bee, or at the center of the hive, and all the bees crowd around it, and that is the hottest point of the hive because this is a big area heat is generating from. So you have this really hot core with the honey and the queen and the brood, and everyone or all the other bees are around it. So another aspect that allows honeybees to survive the winter is that they stop brooding during the winter months to decrease or increase chances of survival. So this decreases chances of starvation because the brood requires a lot of honey food source and a lot of insulation, and these are limited during the winter months. And the worker bees are more focused on insulating the hive than anything else. So the length of the winter months are going to affect brood rearing activity, and little is known actually about how bees know when to begin brooding again. But it's extremely important because early or late brood onset can be fatal to the hive. If they begin too early and it's still winter, that brood will not survive and it could cause the entire hive not to survive. So this is another key behavior that honeybees participate in order to increase their chances of survival throughout the winter. So how do bees regulate temperature? So while individual bees are cold-blooded, the colony as a whole can regulate nest temperature through thermoregulation, and it allows the honeybees to heat or cool the nest based on the environment. So this means that honeybees are actually temperate. They can, through these practices of thermoregulation, control their temperature. So in this presentation, we're going to look at two forms of thermoregulation. Passive thermoregulation, which is the nest structure that allows for insulation, as well as active thermoregulation, which are the bee behaviors such as clustering, wing fanning, and vibrating that allows them to maintain their internal temperature. So, like I said, these are behaviors found in honeybees, not found in other bee species, that allows them to be temperate and allows them to stay warm when their ambient temperature is not warm. And this is one of the key differences between other bee species that do not survive the winter. So first we're going to look at nest structure, which is how Apis mellifera use passive thermoregulation. So other honeybee species that hibernate for the winter live on a single open honeycomb, while Apis mellifera builds a closed nest cavity. It's specifically designed with a small entrance on the bottom and minimized volume in order to help with insulation. And so the honey and the brood are stored in the center of this nest, and this design is what allows it to stay insulated and warm through the winter. You can see in the pictures on the right, at the top we have an example of an open honeycomb hive, and then on the bottom we have an example, although cartoonish, of what an Apis mellifera hive would look like. You can see the differences, and you can see how one provides more of a shelter through the winter. So this design allows for insulation in the winter, and as I said before, it is a form of passive thermoregulation. So next, our first active thermoregulation practice we're going to look at is bee clustering. So this is a form of social thermoregulation, and all the bees kind of form a tight swarm or cluster inside the hive around the center, and this is how they work together to kind of provide insulation. So the way the cluster works is it forms once outside temperatures drop below 57 degrees Fahrenheit, and the honey and the queen go in the center, like we saw in an earlier slide. And then the rest of the bees kind of crowd around them. The colder it is outside, the tighter the cluster is, and they all face with their heads inward. And this is the first practice and first eusocial behavior that allows the bees to stay warm as a whole and remain temperate even though each individual bee is cold-blooded. And the diagram on the left kind of shows this. It shows the endothermic behavior of beehives and how it's warmest in the center and colder as you move outside. So next we have wing fanning and vibrating. So these are two more behaviors that are examples of active thermoregulations or thermoregulation that allow bees to generate heat in the wintertime. So bees on the outside of the cluster flex the muscles of their thorax to vibrate, and this allows them to raise the temperature of the cluster to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. And they can even press their warm thoraxes to capped cells in the hive to heat them up. And when these bees get cold, they can move towards the center of the hive, where we've seen in other diagrams that it's warmer and where there's honey to generate heat, and other worker bees move to the outside, and they can kind of take turns. And on the reverse side, if it gets too hot, other bees can fan their wings to disperse excess heat. So this shows how even though bees are cold-blooded, they participate in these certain behaviors to allow them to generate heat, and when they're in the cluster and they're all touching, they can generate heat for each other. And this is depicted well in the diagram below. You can see how it's hot in the center. You have the queen bee and you have the honey bee, or the honey storage, and then you kind of have this heat shield around it, this cluster forming, and the bees on the outside are generating heat for the rest of the hive. So, in conclusion, Apis mellifera have unique qualities to their species that allow them to adapt to different climates. And their honey stores, their brood rearing activity, and thermoregulation behaviors allow them to keep warm during winter months. And as with almost everything that honeybees do that we've learned and talked about this semester, the entire colony must work together for the survival of the hive. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I hope you learned something. After this, I'll show a short slide of references for you to view as you would like, and that's all.